Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of the Google SRE podcast, or as we affectionately refer to it, the Prodcast. Here with me again as co-host is Pam.
Hello.
And today we're going to be hearing from a couple of SREs here at Google who are a little further along into their careers than the folks we already heard from. And we're going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Theo Klein, and I've been a site reliability engineer here at Google for just over 3 years. Currently, I work on the reliability efforts around the infrastructure that powers the ingestion, curation, and storage of all of the data that powers Google Maps. And this is essentially my first SRE job, my first real job out of college, and it's been super awesome.
Hi, my name is Shannon, and I work on the Linux team. Google has our own internal Linux distribution based on Debian testing. So I work on the team that does development and maintains that operating system. I've been at Google for just over 7 years, and I have been in my role as an SRE for 2 years, having worked the previous 5 years in our internal support team.
Then why don't we start with you, Shannon, around that? What was your path into SRE coming from those other support teams? And do you want to get into that story a bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I got my start working at Google through what we call TechStop, which is providing internal support to Googlers. I was lucky enough to get an internship in our Boston office in my junior year of university. Then I was able to convert into a full-time postgraduate program called the IT residency program. So I worked in our New York office for 26 months. And then I applied for a permanent position in TechStop as what we call a corporate operations engineer in London. And I worked in that role for 5 years. Linux has been a lifelong passion of mine. And so when I was working in TechStop for those 5 years, I was really focused on Linux support and providing the best experience possible for our Linux users internally. And so after the 5 years, there was open headcount on my current team. And so I applied for it and was lucky enough to get the job. And I've loved it ever since.
That's awesome. Theo, do you want to share your path into Google and SRE?
Yeah, sure. I came into SRE pretty much straight out of college. At university, I was studying cognitive science and computer science, and I really had no experience in computer science prior to university. In university, I didn't really understand what the industry was like, and I stumbled into an internship at Microsoft where I was doing software engineering, like pure software stuff. I was working full stack on Azure, and I knew that I wanted to be in New York City after university. And unfortunately, Microsoft didn't have any engineering offices at the time in this area. So I applied to Google, and at the time, the only position that was open was in site reliability engineering. And I said, what is site reliability engineering? I have never heard about this before. What is this? And then initially, I was really skeptical. I thought, okay, I'm going to be doing a lot of DevOps stuff. I'm not necessarily interested in DevOps. What I like working on is algorithms and improving code. So despite that skepticism, I knew that I really wanted to be in New York. So I applied and I ended up getting the job. And the thing that really held me into this position initially was the fact that if I didn't like it, I had the opportunity to transfer from the position called SRE SWE to full SWE. So SWE means software engineering. So I told myself I'm going to give it 6 months and see if I like it. And if I really don't like being a site reliability engineer, then I'm going to change teams internally after 6 months of being here at Google, and I'll just give it a shot. And so I joined Google, and for a variety of factors that I'll get into later, I actually fell in love with site reliability engineering. And so I've stayed in SRE for the past 3 years, and I've actually stayed on the same team for the past 3 years.
It's really awesome to hear your perspective, Theo, and your, almost hesitation at getting started as an SRE. I can really relate to that myself. When I first started at Google, I had this very specific mental image of what an SRE was. And when I looked at my own mental model of myself, I didn't fit into that. And so when other people started suggesting, hey, have you thought of this as a career? I was very hesitant to, especially because everything that I thought of an SRE as being was coding, coding, coding. And I was really lucky enough to do a rotation with an SRE team. And I had a lot of really great encouragement from other amazing engineers that I worked with to pursue this job. And the reality is that SREs come from all walks of life with different backgrounds, and it's that diversity that makes our team stronger. For instance, having been in user support, I've always had this mindset focusing on users, how they'll use our product, and that comes into effect when you think about how rollouts are going to affect people, how communications around that have to go. And we have a strong mix of both SRE SWEs like you, but we also have site reliability engineers on what we call the systems engineers ladder. I'm not as good of a coder, but I have a huge background and lots of interest in systems engineering. So I'm a Linux person. And having that mix of SRE SWEs and the syseng folks on every single team has really made us as SREs and our team stronger, because you do have that diversity of background, that diversity of interest, and we work better when we're all a little bit different.
Our skills complement each other, truly.
Definitely. That is the best way to put it.
And I think one of the standout things with going into an SRE role is you do kind of need a little bit of both, right? You still end up taking the coding interview, and if you weren't coming right out of college, you would take possibly a system design interview. So you do need to know a little bit of both coding and systems. I feel like as you grow in your SRE career, you do level up in each category so that you can not only write the code, or you can also review the code, and you can not only design the system and also review the system design.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing both of your stories and your hesitations with us.
That actually does make me think of something that's, I think, a pretty powerful and important phenomenon in SRE is not only do we kind of need to have these broad-based knowledge between software engineering and systems engineering, and everyone kind of has a little different a mix of that, but then like within a team, people develop a niche that they fit into, because we can't actually know everything, even about the systems we support. So I'd be curious to hear from each of you about your journeys, like finding your own niche once you became an SRE, and how a little bit of your journey as SREs has developed.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I totally agree with you that the individual members on my team have specific expertise in different areas. And with that said, if you have an interest in an area that you are not an expert in, I think that, at least in my team, we're very encouraging to allow people to explore. But in particular, with my journey and finding my expertise, I had always signaled an interest in doing coding projects. And so from the very first project that I worked on, I was essentially like working embedded in a specific developer team to improve the reliability of their system through software engineering projects. So my very first project was working on a very important core piece of Google Maps infrastructure. And it was running on some very legacy binary dating back to, say, like 2008. And no one had touched it. The only thing that was updating in this binary was the data that was being served by this binary. And times change, systems change, and the requirements change for the production environment. And none of those changes had been implemented in this old binary. And so my goal, my responsibility for this first project was go into this extremely important piece of system and modernize it, bring it up to date with the best practices of SRE today. And so can you imagine, as like a new grad coming out of college and then being handed a project that says, take this central piece of software, if it breaks, you break Google, right? But if it breaks, you break Google, but you are now responsible for bringing it up to times. And that was so crazy. That first day after I left work for that day, I was so scared. But at the same time, I was also really excited because I knew that I was going to be working on a really important project. And so it took me a few months and I launched it. The launch window was several months long for different parts of Google, and it was a huge success. And so that sort of told me that I needed to find the scariest problems in the problem space that were on call for and find ways to solve that with engineering. So over the few projects after that, I kept on doing similar types of projects where we take old systems and we want to modernize it, or we want to migrate backends. And so I'm not necessarily building new features, right? The API layer of the system remains the same, but the internals are changed such that the reliability is increased. Now, over the past year and a half, I've been working on a slightly different project. It's a project that we call Zero Outages. And the goal of this program is to essentially eliminate all serving outages from the services that we're on call for. The way that we do this is that we're actually automatically analyzing all of the dependencies in the system and ensuring that the dependencies that are in our system are meant to be there. And so we have an auditing tool that will flag risky dependencies. And then we do engineering projects to remove those risky dependencies. So in that way, it's sort of a two-pronged approach. We've got the auditing tool that will generate alerts. And so I put on my program manager hat to manage all of the alerts that are generated. And then I do engineering projects to mitigate or resolve those risky dependencies.
Shannon, what has been your niche at Google and SRE?
Obviously, having a user support background, that sort of mindset, user support, UI, UX is a niche of mine. But I didn't find my true SRE hat niche until I got my Noogler project. And originally the bug I was assigned was a little tiny compact bug. I thought it was a good bug to start with because I had an idea of how to fix it. But then when we started diving deeper, it was a 7-year dependency full of spiders that nobody had wanted to touch. And so it became this huge project, this huge Noogler project. And it was really important to get it right because upgrading to this dependency was going to mean a fundamental change in how people interacted and used their Linux machines at a critical time where people were sometimes in the office, sometimes working from home. And so they really needed to make sure that they had a consistent experience with their machine. And not doing this project was no longer an option because the upstream community had moved on and we were deviating so far away from what upstream was going to do that this project had to be done. And we had some very critical dependencies that we couldn't upgrade. So we had to imagine a solution around it. And it was so interesting to really kind of dive deep into critical low-level Linux fundamentals like dbus to really understand what they were doing and how they were interacting with every other part of the system. And so I designed a solution for this upgrade and I coded it and we tested it and we went to go send out the email telling everybody that this is the new hot shiny thing. We got a lot of negative feedback and we didn't actually end up going with this solution. We ended up having to take it back to the drawing board and re-engineer something brand new. And the cool thing about that is it became an even deeper niche because now we were thinking about a program one way and now we have to explore even deeper to reimagine this whole solution. It was more complicated the second time around, but we did end up releasing something that met all of our users' needs, that was supportable, that got us past that dependency that we had been somewhat avoiding for years. Now that that dependency is removed and we have this thing I designed, I am now the subject matter expert of this design. And the cool thing is that we have a bunch of different projects that kind of touch those relationships that I developed while working on my nuclear project. And so now I have this niche and these connections and this subject matter expertise that what I originally thought would be this one tiny little project is now something that touches my day-to-day work and multiple projects going forward. But the whole experience had been just really great. My team supported me the entire way through the initial rollout to the secondary rollout to supporting it.
What I really like about this is that it really demonstrates the variety of areas that SRE has expertise in. You're working in quite a low level in like the tech stack, so to speak. You're working very deep on the internals of Linux and how Linux operates and how all of us at Google get to use Linux. Whereas I work at the very top of this stack where I'm thinking only about the business logic and more abstractly how the different components of business logic interact with each other. And at the same time, like we need SREs and throughout this whole stack, right? We need SREs that focus on the internals of Linux, but we also need SREs to think about the broader view of how our systems operate or how the business operates through the code.
Definitely, because the thing about SRE is that those principles of site reliability engineering work just as much on low-level Linux internals as they do on high-level business infrastructure, as they do in the backends that keep Gmail running. And that is, when you design something, you want to design something that is fundamentally reliable, it works, that you're developing something that users need and users can use, and that you know will work, because you don't want to develop something that, whether it's high-end business logic or low-level Linux internals, that is going to break and you're not sure why. So those principles of site reliability engineering are fundamental, wonderful engineering principles that do a lot of good things for teams across Google.
That's pretty awesome. It sounds like both of you have had really impactful projects right from the start in your SRE career. You've mentioned getting team support for these projects. What is your support network like as you got started in your SRE career?
So I'm super lucky that I started in the IT residency program because there's such a strong alumni network of people who used to be in that program in all different roles at Google. And it's really amazing to feel comfortable reaching out to these people, and they know exactly what you're going through because they've been there themselves. And so that's a really strong support network that I was really lucky to have. And they were able to give me advice about what it was like to be an SRE and that sort of encouragement. But also my team is just an amazing support network. Going back to that first failed rollout, my team provided so much support in that they made it clear that, an engineer is never in a silo and project is not just one person. So other people contribute to code. When we as a team, somebody reviewed the code, multiple people coded for it, and as a team decided what direction that we wanted to take, and we agreed on it. So the amazing thing about being on a team and being an SRE is post-mortem blameless culture, is that your team is always there to support you. And whether things go bad or things go good, you fail and you succeed as a team.
Yeah, and to add on to that, the post-mortem culture, especially in SRE, I think is extremely strong. And it has allowed me as an individual, but my team to try out risky projects and risky actions without the fear that we will suffer the blunt of the repercussions if the risks don't pan out in the way that we would like them to. And so something that I always think about when I go on call, for example, is something that my manager repeats often. And it's that my manager will always have my back for every decision that I make when I'm on call. Even if, as a consequence of my action, the system operates even worse than at the beginning of the incident. And we've had moments where I have issued a command or a colleague has issued a command that has globally taken down a service. And the way that we interpret that is not that this engineer has made a mistake and that they should be reprimanded. Rather, the way that we interpret that is that the system was designed in such a way that allows this vulnerable action to be made by an engineer, by a human. And therefore, the system is at fault. And we should change the system to be more safe and prevent those actions from being made in the first place. And that nuance, I think, is so important because it allows us to make faster decisions and to worry less about the potential negative effects that may happen as a result of those. And I guess another point here is that by changing the system as opposed to changing the person, we can ensure that when that person leaves the company and a new person joins, that same mistake won't happen again. So these rules are encoded in the system as opposed to the person in their mental model of how on-call operates. One thing that I think is really cool as well is that this postmortem culture has sort of bled into my personal life and my social life. So I have a partner, and at the beginning of our relationship, it was very much, me versus them. I can't believe you didn't do X, or I would receive, I can't believe you didn't do the dishes. You have to think about this and that. And with this blameless postmortem culture, we're reframing the disagreements or perhaps the negative things that happen as a factor of how the system got us into that situation. And so now it's much more about me and them against the system. And that has become so beneficial for my relationships and for my social network. I was giving a small informal talk to some folks when I was traveling. These were high school students. And I was giving a talk on this blameless postmortem culture. And I was stepping through how we do this at Google. And I was giving very technical examples. And at the end of the talk, a teacher came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, I wish you had been here 6 months ago." And I say, "What do you mean?" And this teacher elaborated that they had gone on this international trip to Germany. They're based out of Argentina. And in this trip, there were many things that went wrong. There were certain incidents, so to speak. And the students that experienced these incidents decided to, or they were very frustrated because there was something about maybe like a bus not working properly, maybe there weren't enough seats, or perhaps they were late. And the students were understandably frustrated, but they didn't really know how to express it. And so there was a lot of blaming going about. Some teachers were blamed, some administrators were also blamed for whatever happened. And they realized that they could have used this blameless postmortem culture to analyze the system in a way that would have been much more constructive. And so after I spoke to them about this, they actually reanalyzed all the failures that had happened on this trip, and they were able to make some changes, which I thought was so cool, right? So this culture of blaming the system as opposed to blaming the people, I think, has ramifications beyond just SRE and computer science, right? But it's a very social thing that I think allows us to make more efficient progress.
I 100% agree with you. Blame serves no productive purpose. It doesn't serve that in your personal life, and it doesn't serve it in your professional life either. Because if you think about it, if you have people who are afraid of the repercussions of a mistake that they made, they're not going to want to talk about it. They're not going to want to admit it. And then we lose the opportunity to make things better. If you give people the opportunity to say, "I did this thing, it did not work," we can now talk about why did it not work? How can we make the system better? And critically, part of the blaming the system, not the person, is also not blaming the person who designed the system, because that is a very key part of that too, is that it's not that, oh, the person who designed the system is bad and their design was flawed. It was, how can we make it better? So that is super important to think about it. And that blameless postmortem culture is something that we teach from day one in SRE orientation at Google, because it is that important to make sure that we learn from everything that happens here. Additionally, when an outage happened or something happened, a team can always request a postmortem of an outage or a problem or a bug or whatever. And the cool thing about being an SRE at Google is that obviously you work with other partners, developers, SREs. And so when something happens, another team or person can always request a postmortem. And just like they should not be afraid of asking for one, nobody should ever feel bad about having to write one. It's not a punishment or a bad thing to have somebody say to you, can you write a postmortem about what happened here? That's never a bad thing. It's not a criticism about your project or your code or your handling of a situation. The attitude at Google is to be open and honest and have these difficult conversations.
To add on to that, I would be even stronger in my opinions about postmortems in particular. I love writing postmortems and I love talking about postmortems, specifically because I think it's so cool to see how our systems break and then to just sit around in amazement and say, oh my gosh, like these were the steps. Like this is so complicated. How on earth did da-da-da-da-da, right? And I think that that is so exciting and fun. And so I guess that this description shows you that you can reframe these incidents in a positive light as an opportunity for learning, as opposed to a scary experience like you were describing, Shannon.
Yeah. One of my SRE mentors, her name was Tanya Riley. Amazing. One of the things she would always say to new SREs was that when there's an outage and something happens, the best way to think about it is thank you. Thank you for finding this bug. Thank you for finding this vulnerability. It's not, oh man, now I have to fix this thing. It's thank you for showing us what can be better. So she would always say, be thankful about your outages, be thankful about these lessons learned. And that is such an amazing way to think about and such a happy way to approach an outage, basically.
Yeah.
It's so great to do a postmortem review because we do one with all of the core platforms teams. And it is just so interesting to see how all of the different teams, like what breaks on whose system, because there's sometimes that another team would present a postmortem at our weekly postmortem review, and I was like, oh my God, that could have been us. And now you think, okay, well, now that you've done this, we can fix this too.
And SREs, in some ways, we need postmortems because a lot of times engineering work that we implement comes as a result of those postmortems because they identify systemic risks in our systems. So it's part of our lifeblood.
This is a very interesting topic because blameless postmortems are a layer to what is so great about SRE culture and the psychological safety that's embedded into it. Why don't we talk about what psychological safety means to each of you?
Yeah. So psychological safety is really important to me. It means a few things. And I guess the best way to describe what psychological safety is, for me at least, is to give some examples. So psychological safety to me means being able to be vulnerable with my coworkers. So sharing parts and details that may put me potentially in a bad light. Let's say I wrote something that didn't work properly. I'm able to share that without the fear of being accused of something. In some ways, that's sort of like a growth mindset. We're all working to become better individuals, and better coworkers and better engineers. And every opportunity that we have in life is an opportunity to grow. So I'm able to be vulnerable with my coworkers. I'm also able to provide feedback, opportunities to grow to my coworkers. And I'm also comfortable enough to receive feedback from coworkers. And I have that space to process that feedback without necessarily taking it the wrong way. I also, as I said earlier, I think this, we had some examples, both Shannon and I, where we are able to take risks and make mistakes without the fear that I'm going to get fired, right? I know that I'm not going to get fired, even though I'm going to make mistakes at my job. Again, because we're learning, we're going to make mistakes. And the only way to learn is to try things out, try new things. And sometimes those efforts don't go in the right way. Additionally, psychological safety also means that in the rare case where something is uncomfortable socially or technically, I know that I have someone that I can reach out to that isn't necessarily HR. I know that I can go to my manager and I can share very vulnerable things and I can bring up conflicts, or I can even bring up technical issues, and I know that my manager has my back. My manager will go up to bat for me, and that makes me feel really safe. So, in short, I'm able to be vulnerable with my coworkers and show the opportunities where I can learn. I can also trust that my coworkers feel the same way. And I know that my manager is able to provide that safety net where, in the case where, let's say, other teams have issues, or maybe they are trying to push for things that we're not comfortable with, I know that my manager will step up to bat for us and protect us.
That is really an amazing point about feedback. I definitely think that psychological safety means being able to ask questions, get advice, and give my honest opinions without worrying that any of that is going to be dismissed. Honestly, it's happened before on my team that a random question that just came out of nowhere had us completely rethink an approach. One of my coworkers likes to say, there's no stupid questions. Like, I had this bad habit of when I started, it was like, I have a stupid question. And he would always be like, well, actually, Shannon, that's a really good question. And that feels empowering. Another key component of psychological safety to me is how I'm perceived as a woman engineer. It's been my experience from time in my university and at some of the jobs I've had before at Google that I wasn't really seen as an engineer, but I was a woman engineer, and I was always given less technical tasks and my ideas held less weight. I took a software engineering class, and basically they tried to just push all of the documentation off to me, thinking that I should write all of that and they would work on the code. And it took a lot of pushback to be like, no, we're all going to work on this. That sort of attitude and those behaviors really damage your sense of belonging. When you're given the less glamorous tasks and you're not seen to be as the same standing as they are, you don't feel like an engineer. I really like that at Google, I'm always seen as an equal to any other engineer. I'm seen as an equal to other engineers that I work with, and my ideas stand on their own merit. I've never once at Google had to think, oh, is my idea bad or is it bad because it came from me? Having the ability to be heard and respected as a person and as an engineer helps build cohesive teams. I really feel like people should always be made to feel like they have something useful to contribute. And a huge part about psychological safety at Google is you are able to be fully yourself at work. And what that means is that, for instance, my desk at work is covered in little cat figurines, many of which were gifts from other Googlers. I get to do my work at a desk that makes me happy and truly represents me as a person. Being able to connect with my coworkers on a personal level and a professional level is a really key part of what makes me really proud and happy to be a Googler. And it's just such a key part of psychological safety and belonging for me.
So I think we've heard a lot today so far about the role itself and a lot of the culture of SRE. One aspect that we might not have touched on is a little bit, particularly like being on call and the stress of being on call, which I'm not interested in. I'm interested in how you come away from that and how you reset and ground yourselves outside of the stress that SRE can produce.
That, I think, is something that has become even harder with the pandemic and with COVID-19 because we were all working from home. So the way that I think many people would de-stress after working is by taking some time during their commute to go home, and maybe you're in a different space physically, so you can potentially leave that stress outside in the office. And that's how I dealt with the stress of on-call and other sorts of work-related issues. However, at the start of the pandemic, when we all went to work from home, I was working 2 feet away from where I was eating, which was 10 feet away from where I would sleep, and 15 feet away from where I would shower, right? All of these things are within 20 feet of each other, give or take 10 feet, right? And my partner would work behind me. And so that caused a lot of issues because my world just shrank and I had no space to leave my stress when I would end the workday. It was initially really challenging to separate work from life. And I tried a few things, vegging out on the couch, scrolling on TikTok, on Reddit, etc. And that worked to a certain extent. But actually what ended up allowing me to separate work from life was actually getting a dog. This isn't why I got a dog. I had wanted a dog for a long time, but it was one of the happy side effects of raising a puppy because dogs actually have needs like humans, and they are very communicative as to when they need something. And that has actually played a really big role in how I start and stop work, both at the beginning of the day, in the middle of the day, and at the end of the day. And for example, my dog Biscotti, who is super cute, and now she's curled up in a ball, sleeping on her dog bed. But she essentially starts my workday right before it because I have to walk her in the morning. And I take a 15, 20, 30-minute walk in the park where I'm essentially meditating, right? Just by virtue of walking in the park. At lunch, I get the opportunity to spend time outside, get some fresh air, come back for lunch, not thinking about work, but thinking about my walk in the park and my playing fetch with Biscotti. At the end of the day, at 5 o'clock on the dot, at 5 o'clock, she comes up to me and she pokes me on the foot. She nudges me. She sits down next to my desk and tells me the workday is over. Playtime is now. Let's go to the park. And so I realized, okay, let's go, right? Oh, there she is.
Right on cue.
Right on cue. And it's almost noon. So I have to take her out soon. So she has given me those specific points where I understand, this is the end of the workday. And by going outside, by walking her, by playing with her, I am able to reset myself and then come home, not in work mode, but in life mode.
So much better than alarms.
I totally agree. Particularly because you can silence an alarm, but you really can't tell a dog to, to deal with their needs, right? They need us for a lot.
The pandemic was definitely challenging. I also live in a very big city, and in London, apartments are very, very small. And so I could literally just kind of touch my desk with my foot from the bottom of my bed. And so I could just kind of roll over and get to work, which makes it very difficult to not just keep working. People would send me pings outside of working hours because my working hours differ so much from my colleagues in the US. And I found it super hard to, when the computer is right there, not to answer it. And so the solution there was do something that has absolutely nothing to do with technology, which for me was crafting. So I do a lot of embroidery and knitting and crocheting because there's nothing with a chip in that. The patterns are all on paper. It's yarn, it's sticks, it's fabric. When you're focusing on all those tiny stitches and making sure that everything is the right tension and the right colors and the right pattern, it's kind of very meditative, just looping and looping and looping and looping. When I'm in that mode, I'm not checking my phone. So it doesn't matter if everybody in the world is pinging me. So it's definitely been very helpful to get away from technology and detach entirely. Another thing I found super helpful during the pandemic was really trying to maintain those social connections. A lot of how I would understand when the workday finished was my coworkers coming up to me or my friends pinging me and saying, let's go get dinner, let's do this thing, let's go to the pub after work, whatever. And obviously when all of those things are closed and you can't see any of these people, there's not that kind of signal of let's go away from your desk, Shannon. we tried to recreate that virtually. And so we would have virtual game nights where we would play Euro Truck Simulator together, or we would have virtual pub nights and do Jackbox over Google Meet. So it was that way to kind of still, even though I'm on a computer, even though we can't be with each other physically, to kind of stop, you are no longer working now, come hang out with us, even if we couldn't see each other in person.
I think your point about proximity to tech and silencing notifications is a really salient point, and it's something that I don't do enough of. And I think this problem is compounded by the fact that a lot of us are really passionate about what we do. And so we want to continue working. At least I want to continue working on the problems that I care about. And so it's super easy if a notification brings us back into the workspace. It's super easy to say, oh, okay, yeah, let me just do this for another 5, 10, 15 hour. So it's really important to be rigorous about when the workday ends and hold yourself to that, especially in the life of, or in the world of work from home. It's extremely easy to revert back into the workspace after the workday ends.
Yes, it's amazing that you're super passionate. There are totally a million ways to still be passionate about technology and do things in technology without having to be at work. Because the great thing about being a site reliability engineer is that someone's always looking for those skills. I would like to take this time to say that open source is looking for amazing developers, SREs, people to kind of help them out. And that's a good way to be passionate about technology, keep coding, keep doing things, and have it be nothing about what you do on your daily basis. I maintain a genome package upstream in Debian, and it's super rewarding to be able to contribute something that other people use. And it's a great way to meet other people in that technology space that have nothing to do with your day-to-day work job. And so if you want to have technology be your passion, open source is a great way to meet people and get involved in something that has nothing to do with your job.
Now, I also want to make another point, which is I'm making these clear distinctions between work and life, and I'm also adding sort of time boundaries. But on the flip side to that, I also know that in the case where life comes up and a pressing issue appears, I know that I have the ability to take time out of the day to handle those. So again, with respect to my dog, the vet is only open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., which is usually when people work. I know that I can take 2 hours out of the day to handle a vet appointment and then come back to work knowing that my coworkers understand that life comes first. So that flexibility, I think, is really valuable.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation and wonderful exchange.
Thank you both for being awesome guests. This was a lot of fun and a very interesting episode with so much content that I don't know how we're going to produce this into a digestible episode.
You can have the regular cut and then the director's cut. And the director's cut could just be the raw stream.
Release the Snyder cut of episode 3 of the podcast. Thank you all again.
Podcast. The Google SRE Production Podcast is hosted by MP English and produced by Celine Birgi. The podcast is edited by Jordan Greenberg. Engineering by Paul Guglielmino and Jordan Greenberg. Javi Beltran composed the musical theme. Special thanks to Steve McGee and Pamela Vong.